A professional MMA fighter tried to demonstrate his takedown technique on a royal guard, expecting to prove military training obsolete. But when his hands made contact, the guard's response left him completely immobilized in seconds, teaching him a humbling lesson about real combat that no octagon could prepare him for. Here's what happened. Now, before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Subscribe to the channel because tomorrow at the same time, we'll bring you another story of courage and discipline from the Royal Guards that you won't want to miss. The morning sunlight glinted off the ornate gates of Buckingham Palace as Dominic the Destroyer Mercer approached, his heavyweight frame casting a long shadow across the cobblestones. At 6'4" and 245 pounds of sculpted muscle, Dominic moved with the predatory grace that had made him a sensation in the UFC's heavyweight division. His promotional tour for next month's title fight had brought him to London, where his undefeated 12-0 record had already generated significant buzz among British fight fans. "Look at them," Dominic mused, nodding toward the Royal Guards standing at attention. "Perfect posture, but completely impractical from a combative standpoint." He spoke with the analytical precision of someone who'd spent 20 years mastering the science of human combat, beginning with an Olympic wrestling background before transitioning to professional mixed martial arts. His coach, Trevor Phillips, nodded in practiced agreement. "Static positions like that would get you demolished in the octagon," he replied, the subtle Manchester accent revealing his own British fighting pedigree. No weight distribution for countering, no mobility for evasion. Melissa Chen, Dominic's sports nutritionist, seemed less interested in the tactical assessment. "We should keep moving," she suggested, checking her watch. "You have that interview with BBC Sport in 2 hours. Dominic ignored her, his fighter's eyes narrowing as he studied guard Michael Fraser, whose ceremonial uniform concealed the lean muscle and combat experience gained through 8 years with the Royal Marines, including specialized close-quarters combat training and 2 tours in classified operations that would never appear in any public record. "That bearskin cap has got to weigh, 5 pounds?" Dominic continued, approaching the guard with the confident stride of someone accustomed to analyzing opponents. "Restricts peripheral vision, creates neck strain, completely counterproductive to situational awareness." His voice carried the authoritative tone of someone whose opinions on fighting were rarely questioned. Several tourists turned to look, recognizing the UFC logo on Dominic's fitted jacket. 2 teenagers nudged each other, clearly fight fans who'd spotted the contender. A small cluster of visitors had already raised their phones, capturing the unusual sight of the famous fighter conducting his impromptu analysis of the Royal Guard's stance. "Completely ceremonial," Dominic continued, his fighter's mind cataloguing perceived weaknesses and tactical disadvantages. "In a real combat situation, that rigid posture creates predictable movement patterns, restricts adaptability, limits reaction time." Each observation delivered with the certainty of someone who had spent thousands of hours studying the biomechanics of effective fighting. Little did he know that beneath the ceremonial exterior stood a man whose combat training had been forged not for spectators or scorecards, but for battlefields where mistakes meant more than lost points. "The center of gravity is completely wrong," Dominic announced, circling guard Fraser with the measured steps of a fighter sizing up an opponent in the cage. "In MMA, we'd call this a static defensive failure." He gestured to the guard's perfectly aligned feet. Weight distribution is 50-50, making him vulnerable to level changes and momentum shifts. Any decent wrestler would exploit that in seconds. Trevor nodded sagely, having coached fighters for over 20 years. "Classic form over function training," he agreed, speaking loudly enough for nearby tourists to hear. "Military drilling prioritizes uniformity over combat efficiency. We see this all the time when former military guys try to transition to professional fighting." A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by Dominic's confident analysis and recognizable presence. A family from Germany watched with interest, the father translating Dominic's technical breakdown to his wide-eyed sons. "See the fixed position of the hands on the weapon?" Dominic continued, now addressing the growing audience directly. "That creates a telegraphed response pattern. In the octagon, telegraphed movements get you knocked unconscious." He demonstrated a lightning-fast level change, the kind that had earned him 4 first-round victories. Fighting is about adaptability, fluidity, and millisecond adjustments. Guard Fraser remained motionless, his eyes fixed forward, his discipline unwavering despite being subjected to this professional critique. Beneath his ceremonial uniform, the guard's muscles maintained the perfect tension required for his duty. Not too rigid to restrict blood flow, not too relaxed to compromise posture. A balance developed through years of training that Dominic's analysis had completely missed. "It's like comparing modern automotive engineering to a horse and carriage," Dominic explained to a young tourist who'd asked for a selfie. After obliging, he continued his assessment. "These ceremonial guards represent outdated combat methodology. My training incorporates neurological optimization, biomechanical efficiency, and adaptive response patterns." Trevor chimed in. "Dom's resting heart rate is 38 beats per minute. His fast twitch muscle fiber ratio is in the top 0.01 percentile. He's literally evolved beyond traditional combat paradigms." A few tourists shuffled uncomfortably at the increasingly dismissive tone, while others appeared genuinely interested in this behind-the-scenes analysis from a professional fighter. "The neck position alone creates fatal vulnerabilities," Dominic continued, moving closer to the guard, pointing out specific anatomical landmarks. "The cervical alignment is compromised by the headgear weight, creating tension patterns that slow neural transmission to the trapezius and deltoid muscle groups." Melissa attempted to intervene, placing a hand on Dominic's arm. "We should probably move on," she suggested quietly. "Just a minute," Dominic replied, his fighter's curiosity now fully engaged. "I want to demonstrate something." He positioned himself beside the guard, adopting a fighter's stance, knees slightly bent, weight on the balls of his feet, hands positioned to protect his center line. This is optimal defensive posture. Balanced weight distribution, protected central nervous system targets, maximized mobility options. The contrast was striking. The fluid, adaptive stance of the professional fighter against the ceremonial stillness of the Royal Guard. What Dominic failed to recognize, however, was that they had been trained for entirely different purposes, one for scored competition, the other for something far more consequential. "I've studied combat science for 20 years, Dominic announced to the growing crowd, and I can tell you with complete certainty that this ceremonial stance represents everything modern fighters have evolved beyond." Dr. Eleanor Reed adjusted her glasses as she observed the developing situation. As a research fellow in combat physiology at Imperial College London, she recognized Dominic Mercer immediately. In fact, his unique neuromuscular responses had been featured in her recent paper on elite athlete performance. What interested her more, however, was the guard's perfect stillness despite significant provocation. A different but equally impressive demonstration of physical mastery. "The fundamental problem with military drilling," Dominic was explaining to the increasingly large crowd, "is that it hardwires predictable response patterns." He demonstrated a feinting motion, the same one that had famously disoriented the Brazilian champion in his last title defense. Modern MMA is built on neurological adaptation, not choreographed movements. Trevor had positioned himself strategically, creating space for Dominic's impromptu demonstration. "Show them the Matisse counter," he suggested, referring to the technique they'd developed specifically for the upcoming title fight. Dominic nodded, shifting his weight subtly. In any combat scenario, reaction time determines outcome. Military training emphasizes uniform reactions. Everyone responds identically to the same stimulus. He executed a blindingly fast sequence of movements, his hands a blur, as they demonstrated precision striking points. Elite fighters develop individualized neural pathways based on their specific physiological advantages. A middle-aged couple stepped back nervously as Dominic's demonstration brought him within feet of the guard. The woman whispered something to her husband, who nodded in agreement, before moving further from the escalating situation. "Look at the guard's positional vulnerabilities," Dominic continued, his voice taking on the cadence of the instructional videos that had made him a social media sensation among fighting enthusiasts. "Fixed head position, vulnerable to vestibular disruption. Locked knees, compromised lateral mobility, restricted hand movements, delayed defensive capability." Dr. Reed stepped closer, her professional curiosity overcoming her usual reticence. "Mr. Mercer," she called out, "perhaps you're overlooking the specialized nature of different combat training methodologies." Dominic turned, immediately recognizing her from the physiological testing his team had participated in last year. "Dr. Reed," he acknowledged with a nod, "with respect, I'm simply pointing out the biomechanical realities. The neurophysiology of combat doesn't change based on uniform." "Actually," she began, "military close-quarters combat training activates different neurological Different from sport fighting, sure," Dominic interrupted, "but ultimately less effective. We've seen this repeatedly when military personnel transition to professional fighting. The success rate is abysmal because they've been hardwired with outdated tactical responses." Trevor nodded enthusiastically. "Remember Johnson? Former Navy SEAL, couldn't adjust to the dynamic targeting required in professional competition. Too rigid in his response patterns." A tour group paused their scheduled route, the guide falling silent as Dominic continued his increasingly animated breakdown. Two security personnel at the far end of the courtyard had taken notice, communicating quietly into their radios as they observed the growing crowd. "The modern fighting landscape has evolved beyond these ceremonial displays," Dominic asserted, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "What we're looking at here is the equivalent of using a broadsword in the age of precision-guided munitions." Dr. Reed shook her head slightly. "That's a fundamental misunderstanding of specialized training objectives," she countered. "Royal Guards undergo extensive ceremonial drilling," Dominic finished for her. "I respect tradition, Doctor, but from a pure combat effectiveness standpoint, everything about this training methodology is counterproductive." Several tourists had formed a semicircle, phones raised to capture the confrontation between the famous fighter and the motionless guard. Among them, a distinguished older gentleman watched with particular interest, his military bearing evident despite his civilian clothes. Brigadier James Harrington, retired, had recognized the escalating situation from 50 yards away, his 30 years of military experience alerting him to the subtle signs of impending trouble. "The proof is empirical," Dominic continued, now fully committed to his impromptu lecture. UFC 278, former military specialist against a trained MMA fighter. Outcome? Unconscious in 48 seconds. The data doesn't lie. Guard Fraser remained perfectly still, though those with trained eyes might have noticed a subtle change in his breathing pattern. Not from concern, but from the automatic combat readiness that elite soldiers develop through years of real-world experience. "What we're looking at," Dominic announced, now playing fully to the gathered crowd, "is the fundamental difference between performance-based training and theatrical tradition." He began demonstrating specific fight techniques, each movement executed with the precision that had made him famous. In the octagon, this level change creates a neurological disruption in the opponent's visual tracking system. Trevor positioned himself to give Dominic more space. "Show them the Kyrgyzstan sequence," he suggested, referring to the combination that had won Dominic his qualifying match for the title shot. Brigadier Harrington moved forward through the crowd, his concern growing as he recognized the direction this demonstration was taking. Having commanded elite units throughout his military career, he understood exactly what the Royal Guards were capable of and the strict protocols that governed their responses. "Mr. Mercer," Harrington called out, his voice carrying the natural authority of someone accustomed to command, "I believe you're operating under some misconceptions about these servicemen." Dominic glanced toward Harrington, quickly assessing the older man with a fighter's instinctive evaluation. "Military background, right? With respect, sir, I've trained with military personnel from 6 countries. The structural limitations of traditional combat drilling are well documented." "These aren't traditional soldiers," Harrington replied calmly. "Royal Guards are drawn from elite regiments with extensive ceremonial training." "Yes," Dominic interrupted, executing a perfect pendulum step to demonstrate his point. "But modern combat sports have empirically proven that traditional military drilling creates exploitable response patterns." He shifted his weight, demonstrating another technical position. The neuromuscular adaptation required for elite fighting cannot develop within rigid command structures. Dr. Reed had moved closer, her scientific curiosity fully engaged. "Mr. Mercer, your assessment fails to account for specialized training objectives. These guards are trained to stand still," Dominic completed her sentence with confident finality. "In combat sports, we have a term for that. We call it a stationary target." His demonstration had brought him within feet of Guard Fraser, whose disciplined stillness remained unbroken despite the proximity. Harrington's expression tightened. "Young man, Guard Fraser served with—" "All due respect to his service," Dominic cut in, "but we're discussing combat effectiveness, not patriotism." He addressed the crowd directly now. "Military training emphasizes uniform responses to standardized threats. Elite fighting requires adaptive neural pathways that respond to emergent tactical scenarios." Trevor nodded enthusiastically. "Show them the differential between fixed position vulnerability and adaptive stance mobility." The crowd had grown larger now, tourists from various countries watching with a mixture of fascination and discomfort. A palace security officer was making his way through the gathered onlookers, still some distance away but clearly responding to the situation. "The fundamental problem," Dominic continued, demonstrating a fighting stance directly in front of the guard, "is that ceremonial drilling creates muscle memory that's counterproductive in actual combat situations." He executed a sequence of feints, each one showcasing his remarkable speed and control. Each of these movements creates neurological impulses that a trained fighter anticipates and counters. But the military drilling focuses on suppressing natural reflexes rather than enhancing them. Harrington stepped forward more urgently. "Mr. Mercer, you're making assumptions about training you don't understand. These guards undergo specialized ceremonial drilling," Dominic finished for him, growing visibly frustrated at the repeated interruptions. "Sir, I've analysed combat methodology across disciplines for 20 years. The empirical evidence is conclusive. Traditional military drilling creates fixed neurological response patterns that elite fighters exploit." He turned back to Guard Fraser, studying him with a fighter's critical eye. "The perfect stillness you're witnessing isn't combat readiness. It's the opposite. Combat readiness requires constant micro-adjustments, weight transfers, and positional awareness." Trevor had positioned himself to capture Dominic's demonstration on his phone. "This is perfect content for the training series," he called out. "Show them the difference between ceremonial posture and actual fighting stance." Dominic nodded, moving directly in front of Fraser. "This ceremonial position," he gestured to the guard, "versus an actual combat-ready posture." He shifted into his fighting stance. Note the weight distribution, the hand position, the engaged core muscles. Every aspect is designed for immediate adaptive response. The palace security officer had finally pushed through to the front of the crowd, but paused, assessing whether intervention was yet necessary. Harrington caught his eye, and gave a subtle shake of his head. This situation was escalating, but protocol dictated specific thresholds for intervention. "I respect the tradition," Dominic continued, "but let's not confuse ceremony with combat effectiveness. If this were a real tactical situation—" He moved closer, his fighter's confidence building with each unreacted challenge. "Let me demonstrate exactly why this ceremonial stance is fundamentally flawed," Dominic announced, now fully committed to his impromptu combat lecture. With the fluid grace that had become his trademark in the octagon, he positioned himself directly in front of guard Fraser, well within what fighters call the engagement zone, that critical distance where combat becomes inevitable. "Trevor, make sure you're getting this," he called over his shoulder. "This is perfect for the biomechanics segment in our training series." What happened next occurred with such calculated precision that many tourists would later disagree about the exact sequence of events. Dominic, with the smooth confidence of a man who had never lost a professional fight, reached out and placed his hands on guard Fraser's shoulders, not aggressively, but with the clinical purpose of demonstrating what he considered a tactical vulnerability. "In MMA, this is called establishing dominant position," he explained to the crowd. "From here, I can control the opponent's center of gravity and execute various takedown sequences." His hands shifted slightly, preparing to demonstrate a technical point rather than actually perform a takedown. "The fixed foot position creates an exploitable—" That's when he made the critical miscalculation. Whether driven by his fighter's instinct to fully demonstrate a technique, or simply caught up in his own lecture, Dominic executed what fighters call a level change, the precursor to a wrestling takedown. His knees bent, his center of gravity dropped, and his hands shifted from demonstration to actual grappling position. A simple momentum shift is all it takes to— Dominic's words cut off abruptly as he committed to the movement, applying just enough force to demonstrate his point without actually taking the guard to the ground. Or so he thought. What Dominic didn't register until it was too late was the microscopic shift in guard Fraser's breathing pattern, the combat veteran's body responding to a threat before conscious thought could even process it. While Fraser's external appearance remained ceremonial, his neuromuscular system had already initiated what special forces operators call autonomous threat response, the body's trained reaction to imminent danger. As Dominic's hands applied pressure and his body lowered for the takedown demonstration, three things happened simultaneously, so perfectly coordinated they appeared choreographed. First, guard Fraser's center of gravity adjusted by approximately 3 centimeters. A shift so subtle it was visually imperceptible but biomechanically transformative. This minute adjustment completely negated the leverage Dominic was attempting to establish, rendering his takedown mechanics ineffective before they'd even fully engaged. Second, Fraser's weight distribution shifted from the ceremonial 50-50 stance to what combat specialists call a rooted diagonal, a specific weight arrangement that creates extraordinary stability while maintaining maximum mobility options. This transition happened without any visible movement of his feet or upper body. Third, and most consequentially, Fraser's arms executed what close-quarters combat instructors call a structural deflection, a precise application of counterforce that doesn't oppose strength directly, but redirects it through anatomical leverage points. The combined effect was as devastating as it was efficient. Dominic, who had initiated what he intended as a controlled demonstration, suddenly found his own momentum and strength turned against him with mathematical precision. His practiced takedown attempt transformed mid-motion into his own destabilization. What the stunned crowd witnessed was the UFC heavyweight contender seemingly losing control of his own body. One moment he was demonstrating a takedown, the next he was caught in a perfectly executed counter that used his own forward momentum to compromise his balance. Fraser, whose ceremonial stillness had now given way to tactical precision, completed the defensive sequence with textbook efficiency. His movements weren't flashy or dramatic, unlike Dominic's octagon performances designed to excite crowds, but rather the minimal necessary actions to neutralize the threat without excessive force. As Dominic's balance failed, a second guard, who had been standing at the adjacent post, moved with similar efficiency. Guard William Collins, who had served in the same specialized unit as Fraser during operations in undisclosed locations, executed a perfect flanking response. The two guards moved in concert with the synchronization that comes only from extensive unit drilling, precisely the kind of training Dominic had been dismissing. "What the—" Dominic gasped as he found himself caught in what military close-quarters combat instructors call a compliance position, a specialized joint manipulation that creates immediate control without causing permanent injury. Unlike MMA submission holds, designed to force a tap-out in competition, this technique was developed for real-world situations where immediate incapacitation might be necessary. The physics was irrefutable. Dominic's 245 pounds of championship muscle were rendered completely ineffective by the precisely applied leverage. His extensive strength training, which had allowed him to overpower every previous opponent, was biomechanically irrelevant against the guard's perfect tactical positioning. What made the situation even more remarkable was that throughout the entire defensive sequence, neither guard spoke a word. There were no warnings, no shouted commands. Just the silent, efficient neutralization of a threat according to their training protocols. The crowd's collective gasp hung in the air as the realization spread. The ceremonial guards, whom many had viewed as living statues, had just demonstrated combat effectiveness that made a championship fighter look like an amateur. Several tourists backed away instinctively, their phones still recording as the situation escalated beyond what anyone had expected. Dr. Reed's scientific observation kicked into high gear. "Fascinating," she murmured, witnessing the practical application of the neurological principles she'd been researching. The difference between competition-optimized and survival-optimized neural pathways. Trevor had stopped filming, his experienced coach's eye recognizing immediately the severity of his fighter's tactical error. "Dom, don't resist," he called out, understanding from years in combat sports that struggling against properly applied joint manipulation only increases the damage. Dominic, for perhaps the first time in his fighting career, found himself completely outmatched, not by superior strength or speed, but by a fundamentally different approach to combat that his championship training hadn't prepared him for. "Stand down, sir," Guard Fraser finally spoke, his voice carrying the quiet authority of command rather than the heated emotion of confrontation. His British accent was clipped and precise, the words delivered not as a request, but as a statement of fact. Dominic, still held in the immobilizing position, had the good sense to recognize when further resistance was both pointless and potentially damaging. "I'm standing down," he managed, the words slightly strained as the joint manipulation restricted his normal breathing pattern. With mechanical precision, the guards released their hold, stepping back in perfect unison to resume their positions, though they remained in a subtle, ready stance, rather than returning immediately to ceremonial posture. Palace security had finally arrived in force, black-suited personnel, creating a perimeter around the scene as the crowd was ushered back to a safer distance. "That was," Dominic began, rubbing his shoulder as he regained his composure, "a textbook counter to an unauthorized physical engagement with a member of His Majesty's Guard," Brigadier Harrington finished for him, stepping forward with military bearing. "What you just experienced, Mr. Mercer, was exactly the combat effectiveness you claimed these servicemen lacked." Trevor and Melissa had moved to Dominic's side, the coach's expression a mixture of concern and embarrassment. "You all right, Dom?" Trevor asked quietly, his earlier enthusiasm completely evaporated. Dominic nodded, his fighter's mind already analysing what had just happened. They countered with perfect biomechanical leverage, he admitted, professional assessment temporarily overriding his wounded pride. I've never felt a joint manipulation applied with that precision. Harrington turned to address the murmuring crowd. What many visitors don't realize, he explained with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to command briefings, is that royal guards are not ceremonial figures with basic training. They are elite soldiers temporarily assigned to ceremonial duty. A security officer approached Dominic, his demeanor professional but unyielding. Sir, I'll need you to come with me. Physically engaging with the Queen's Guard is a serious offence. It was a misunderstanding, Trevor interjected quickly. A professional demonstration that went too far. Mr. Mercer meant no disrespect. The security officer remained unmoved. Intent doesn't change the legal status of the action, sir. Physical contact with the guards is strictly forbidden, as indicated by multiple posted notices. Dr. Reed had moved closer, her scientific curiosity overcoming normal caution. That was remarkable neuromuscular coordination, she observed. The response timing suggests specialized proprioceptive training beyond standard military protocols. The Royal Guards are drawn from 5 infantry regiments, Harrington explained to those still within earshot. Many have extensive special operations experience before receiving this assignment. The ceremonial duty you observe represents additional training, not their primary function. Guards Fraser and Collins had resumed their posts with perfect discipline, their brief deviation from ceremony now corrected as they stood at attention. Nothing in their bearing suggested they had just neutralized a professional fighter. No triumphant expression, no acknowledgement of the crowd's amazed reactions, just the seamless return to duty that characterized everything about their service. The security team was now escorting Dominic away from the scene, his massive frame looking somehow diminished between the efficient palace personnel. Trevor and Melissa followed, the promotional team already shifting into damage control mode as they recognized the potential impact on Dominic's carefully cultivated public image. The charges can include assault on a serviceman, interference with guard duties and disorderly conduct, the lead security officer was explaining as they walked. Given the public nature of the incident and the multiple recordings, this will likely proceed to formal charges. Dominic's expression had transformed completely from his earlier confidence. The fighter's analytical mind was still processing what had happened, how his strength and technique had been so efficiently neutralized by guards he had dismissed as ceremonial figures. Those weren't standard military counters, he said quietly to Trevor as they were led away. That was something else entirely. Harrington, overhearing the comment, fell into step beside them momentarily. Guard Fraser served with the Special Reconnaissance Regiment before his ceremonial assignment, he informed them. 2 combat tours in classified theatres. Guard Collins was Pathfinder Platoon. Both have received specialised close-quarters combat training that, frankly, makes octagon techniques look like playground scuffles. As security led them through a side entrance away from the main tourist areas, Dominic glanced back at the guards, now resumed at their posts as if nothing had happened. The morning sun glinted off their brass buttons, their ceremonial rifles held with perfect precision, their eyes once again fixed forward in the discipline he had so tragically misinterpreted. I completely misread them, he admitted, the professional fighter in him acknowledging the tactical error despite his wounded pride. I saw the ceremony and missed the combat capability beneath it. A common mistake, Harrington replied with a hint of satisfaction. One that various adversaries have made throughout history, often to their considerable regret. The palace courtyard returned to its normal rhythm as tourists resumed their photo opportunities, now maintaining a noticeably more respectful distance from the guards. The incident would soon spread across social media, but for now, the ceremonial changing of the guard continued undisturbed. The ancient tradition carrying on with the same disciplined precision it had maintained through centuries of service. What would you have done in this situation? Would you have recognized the difference between ceremonial appearance and elite combat capability? Or would you, like many, have mistaken disciplined stillness for vulnerability? If this story taught you something new about the Royal Guards, make sure to hit that like button right now. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that reveal the truth behind ceremonial traditions. And don't forget to tap the bell icon so you never miss our daily uploads. We're curious, what impressed you most about the Guards' response? Was it the technical precision, the restraint shown, or the seamless return to duty afterwards? Let us know in the comments below. So check out the videos appearing on your screen right now for more stories of those who learned unexpected lessons about respecting tradition and service. And we'll see you again tomorrow, at the same time, with another brand new video you won't want to miss.